The Galactic Concord had stood for 10,000 years, uniting 340 species under one banner of peace and cooperation. But now that great alliance trembled on the edge of extinction, High Counselor Thaven of the Eldery stood before the massive viewing screen in Concord Central Command, watching the final moments of the Battle of Keth Prime unfold in terrible silence. And his four hearts ached with each ship that vanished from existence. The Vreth Dominion had come without warning, without negotiation, without mercy. And their black vessels moved through space like a plague of shadows consuming everything. In their path, Admiral Korath of the Zentari slammed his fist against the command console as another squadron disappeared. From the tactical display, they adapt too quickly. He growled through his translator, his reptilian scales shifting from green to angry red. Every tactic we use becomes useless within hours. And every weapon we deploy, they learn to counter before we can fire twice. They even watched as the last cruiser of the Keth defense fleet broke apart under concentrated fire, its crew of 12,000 souls becoming nothing more than scattered atoms in the cold void. The Vreth did not take prisoners, did not negotiate, did not stop, and the Concord's analysts had calculated that at the current rate of advance, the Dominion would reach the core worlds within 18 months. "We have tried everything," spoke Delegate Myra of the Crystalline Collective, her voice ringing like broken glass. "Our greatest admirals have failed. Our most advanced weapons have proven useless, and our combined fleets cannot slow them for more than days at a time." The chamber fell into heavy silence as the leaders of 1,000 worlds struggled to find hope where none seemed to exist. Thaven closed his ancient eyes and remembered a decision made 200 years ago. A decision that had seemed wise at the time, but now filled him with regret. "There is one option we have not considered," he said slowly. And every being in the room turned to face him. Admiral Korath's eyes narrowed with suspicion as he asked what option could possibly remain after they had exhausted every resource and every alliance. "The humans," Thaven replied, and the word fell upon the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the command center, and several delegates rose from their seats in protest. The humans were rejected from the Concord, Delegate Mira reminded them. "We deemed them too aggressive, too unpredictable, too primitive in their thinking to join civilized space. We called them feral," Theven acknowledged with a slow nod. "We looked at their history of warfare and decided they were not evolved enough for our society. And we sent them back to their little corner of the galaxy with our contempt as their only gift." Admiral Korath laughed bitterly and said that even if the humans would help, what could one small species possibly do against an enemy that had destroyed 1,000 worlds? "I do not know," Thaven admitted. "But I remember the fear I felt when I first reviewed their military history. And I remember thinking that such a species should never be given access to galactic technology." He paused and looked around the chamber at the desperate faces of leaders who had run out of options. "Perhaps," he continued, "it is time to discover what they have become in the 2 centuries since we turned them away." The diplomatic envoy departed 3 days later aboard the fastest vessel the Concord possessed, carrying a message of desperation to a species they had once rejected as unworthy. Ambassador Thelius of the Eldari led the delegation, and during the long journey to human space, he reviewed every piece of information the Concord had gathered about humanity over the past 200 years. The reports were sparse and contradictory, filled with rumors and speculation but few confirmed facts. And the humans had apparently developed technology to shield their systems from outside observation. When the envoy finally crossed into human territory, they expected to be challenged by defensive platforms or patrol vessels. But instead they found only silence and empty space. "Perhaps they have declined," one of the junior diplomats suggested hopefully. Perhaps their aggressive nature led to self-destruction, as we predicted. Ambassador Thelius said nothing as their vessel continued toward Earth. But a growing unease settled in his chest. Like a cold weight, they found Earth not as a burned-out husk of failed civilization, but as a gleaming jewel of advanced technology that made Concord. Achievements looked primitive by comparison to orbital platforms the size of small moons hung in perfect geometric patterns around the planet, and vessels of unknown design moved between them with silent efficiency. The humans did not seem surprised by the Concord's arrival, and clearance to land was granted almost immediately. As if they had been expected, Ambassador Thelius descended to the surface and found himself standing before a simple building of white stone and glass, where a single human woman waited to greet him. She introduced herself as Director Chun of the United Earth Defense Council, and her calm smile never wavered as she led him inside. "We know why you have come," she said, as they walked down a corridor lined with windows overlooking a vast training facility. "We have been watching the Vreth advance for some time now." Thelius felt his throat tighten as he asked why they had not warned the Concorde. "You made it clear 200 years ago that our involvement in galactic affairs was unwelcome," Director Chun replied without anger or accusation. "We respected your wishes." Through the windows, Thelius could see humans moving through obstacle courses and combat simulations that made his blood run cold. Their movements precise and predatory in ways that seemed almost inhuman. He delivered his message with all the dignity he could muster, explaining the Concorde's desperate situation and formally requesting military assistance from the United Earth Government. Director Chen listened patiently, and when he finished, she simply nodded and said that humanity would answer the call. Relief flooded through Thelius, and he asked how many ships the humans would send, how many soldiers, how much time they would need to mobilize their forces. "We will send 12. Director Chun replied. Thelius waited for her to continue, certain he had misunderstood, but she only watched him with that same calm smile. 12 ships? He finally asked. 12 soldiers, she corrected him. A laugh escaped Thelius before he could stop it, a sound of disbelief and despair, because surely this was some cruel joke at the Concorde's expense. But Director Chun did not laugh, and her eyes held something that made the ambassador's amusement die in his throat. "You rejected humanity because you feared what we were," she said quietly. "You were right to fear us, but you were wrong about the reason." She gestured toward the window, where one of the training humans had just completed a course that should have been physically impossible, moving through it like a ghost made of violence and purpose. "We have spent 2 centuries preparing," Director Chen continued. "Not for conquest, not for revenge, but for the day when the galaxy would need what only we could provide." Ambassador Thelius stared at the humans training below, finally seeing what he had missed before, finally understanding the controlled fury that lived behind their calm exterior. "What are they?" he whispered. Director Chun's smile faded, replaced by something that might have been pride or might have been sorrow. "They are human special forces," she answered, "and 12 of them will be more than enough." 2 weeks later, Ambassador Thelius stood in the docking bay of Concorde Central Command and watched a single human transport descend through the atmospheric shields. The vessel was smaller than he had expected, unremarkable in every way, but something about its arrival made every being in the bay fall silent. The ramp lowered, and 12 humans walked out into the light of a galaxy that had once rejected them, their eyes scanning the crowd with a focus that made Thelius feel like prey. They moved wrong, he realized with growing dread, too quiet and too aware, like predators wearing human skin. And he finally understood what Director Chun had meant. The Concorde had feared humanity for what they were, but they should have feared what humanity could become when given 200 years to sharpen themselves into weapons one name would soon echo across the stars. a name spoken in terror by enemies and whispered in awe by allies. And that name would change the course of galactic history forever. Human special forces had arrived, and the Vreth Dominion did not yet know that their extinction had just begun. Captain Elena Vasquez was the first to step off the transport, and Admiral Korath would later say that he knew in that moment everything had changed. She was not tall by human standards, not imposing in any obvious way, but something about the way she carried herself made the Admiral's predator instincts scream warnings that his rational mind could not explain. Her eyes moved across the docking bay with mechanical precision, cataloging every face and every shadow and every possible threat. And Korath realized with a chill that she had identified 17 ways to kill him before she had taken her second step. The other 11 followed her in perfect formation, each one moving with that same unsettling grace that made them seem more like weapons than people. Lieutenant Commander James Park walked at her right shoulder, his scarred face revealing nothing as his cybernetic eye recorded everything around them in wavelengths that natural vision could never perceive. Sergeant First Class Maria Torres came next, her compact frame hiding strength that could crush steel. And behind her came the others whose names would soon become legends whispered in fear across 1,000 worlds. The Concord officers who had gathered to greet them found themselves stepping backward, without meaning to, their bodies responding to danger their minds had not yet recognized. I am Captain Elena Vasquez, commander of Fireteam Reaper, she announced in perfect galactic standard, her accent flawless despite humanity's isolation from Concord space. Admiral Korath stepped forward with all the courage he could gather and welcomed the humans to Central Command, explaining that quarters had been prepared and that a strategic briefing had been scheduled for the following day. We do not need quarters, Vasquez replied with a slight shake of her head, and we have already reviewed your strategic situation during our journey here. She pulled a small device from her belt and projected a holographic map of Vreth-controlled space into the air between them. Your defensive strategies are failing because you are thinking like prey, she continued, her finger tracing the lines of Concord retreat. You respond to Vreth movements instead of forcing them to respond to yours. Admiral Korath felt his scales flush with embarrassment and anger at being lectured by this small human female. But he held his tongue because desperation had taught him humility. What would you suggest? He asked through clenched teeth. We need intelligence, Vasquez answered. Real intelligence. Not the sensor data your fleets have been collecting from safe distances. She pointed to a world deep in Vreth territory, a planet called Nexus Prime that served as a regional command center for the Dominion's advance. We will infiltrate this world, eliminate its overmind, extract its neural core, and return with complete knowledge of Vreth command protocols. The gathered officers erupted in protests and disbelief, because what she described was not merely difficult but utterly impossible by every measure of military science. Nexus Prime was guarded by 300 Vreth warships and millions of ground troops, protected by defensive systems that could detect a single bacterium from orbit. You cannot possibly expect to survive such a mission, Delegate Myra said. Her crystalline form flickering with distress, Vasquez turned to look at the delegate, and something in her eyes made Myra step backward despite herself. We do not expect to survive, the captain said calmly. We expect to succeed. And those are very different things. The humans requested only a single stealth shuttle and the coordinates of Nexus Prime, refusing all offers of additional support or backup extraction plans. Admiral Korath watched them board their tiny vessel with a mixture of respect and pity, certain he was watching 12 beings march willingly to their deaths. The shuttle vanished into hyperspace, and the Concorde waited for news that never came, because the humans had entered a communications blackout that would last for 3 agonizing days on Nexus Prime. The Vreth Overmind sat at the center of its vast network, connected to billions of drones and soldiers through neural links that spanned light years. It had never known fear, had never conceived of the possibility that it could be threatened. Within the heart of its own territory, the first sign that something was wrong came when a patrol failed to report in from the eastern perimeter of the central hive complex. The Overmind reached out through the network to locate the missing drones and found only silence where their minds should have been. More patrols vanished over the next hours, entire squads disappearing without distress signals or combat reports, as if they had simply ceased to exist. The Overmind increased security and flooded the area with thousands of additional troops. But the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity. Then the explosions began. Detonations that struck critical infrastructure with surgical precision, destroying power nodes and communication relays that had been considered impregnable. The Vreth soldiers began to feel something they had never experienced before, a creeping dread that spread through the collective like a disease. They were being hunted by something they could not see, could not track, could not understand. And their hive mind unity became a weakness as fear passed from one drone to another in endless, amplifying waves. On the third night, the Overmind itself came under attack in its supposedly secure chamber at the heart of the complex. Captain Vasquez emerged from shadows that should have been empty, her blade finding the gaps in the Overmind's armor with practiced ease. And her team materialized around her like ghosts made solid. The battle lasted less than 4 minutes. And when it ended, the Overmind lay dead and its neural core rested in Sergeant Torres's armored hands. The humans vanished back into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of confusion and terror that would ripple through the entire Vreth collective. 3 days after their departure, the stealth shuttle returned to Concord Central Command. And Admiral Korath rushed to the docking bay with his heart pounding in disbelief. The ramp lowered, and all 12 humans walked off the vessel without a single visible injury. Captain Vasquez approached the Admiral and placed the Vreth neural core on the deck at his feet, the glowing sphere containing the complete tactical knowledge of humanity's greatest enemy. "Now we know how they think," she said simply. Korath stared at the neural core, then at the humans, then back at the core, his mind struggling to process what should have been impossible. How? He finally managed to ask. Vasquez tilted her head slightly, as if confused by the question. "We are human special forces," she replied. "This is what we do." The news spread through Concord space like wildfire, and beings who had dismissed humanity as primitive savages began to whisper new words of wonder and fear on Nexus Prime. The Vreth worked frantically to understand what had happened, to identify what kind of weapon could have penetrated their defenses so completely. They searched for evidence of advanced technology, for signs of massive troop movements, for anything that could explain the destruction that had been visited upon them. They found only shadows and silence and the terrible realization that something had changed in this war. The humans had brought something new to the conflict, something the Vreth collective had never encountered in its long history of conquest. They had brought the art of special operations, the science of terror, and a level of individual lethality that hive mind creatures could not comprehend. For the first time in its existence, the Vreth Dominion faced an enemy that did not fight like prey, that did not run when threatened, that did not seek to simply survive. These humans hunted, and they had chosen the Vreth as their prey in the command centers of the Concord. Military leaders began to study the humans with new eyes, watching how Fireteam Reaper interacted with each other and with their alien allies. They noticed how the humans never truly relaxed, how their eyes constantly scanned for threats even in the safest environments, how they seemed to communicate through glances and subtle gestures that conveyed complex tactical information. Lieutenant Commander Park spent hours in the intelligence center, analyzing the data from the neural core with a focus that seemed almost obsessive. Sergeant Torres trained in the combat simulators. Her movements so fast and precise that the Concorde's best warriors could not land a single blow against her, and Captain Vasquez met with the High Council, explaining in calm, measured tones exactly what her team planned to do next. "We will not win this war through fleet battles or planetary sieges," she told them. "We will win by breaking the enemy's will to fight." The council members shifted uncomfortably at her words, because such thinking was alien to species that had evolved beyond what they considered barbaric psychology. "The Vreth are a hive mind," Vasquez continued. "They share thoughts and emotions across their entire collective, which means they also share fear." She smiled, and something in that expression made even the ancient Eldari counselors look away. "We are going to teach them to be afraid." The Vreth collective had consumed 47 civilizations across 3 galaxies, absorbing their knowledge and adding their biological distinctiveness to the hive. And in all that time, they had never experienced what now spread through their shared consciousness like a plague. Fear was a concept they understood intellectually, having absorbed species that knew terror intimately. But they had never felt it themselves until the humans came. It started small. Isolated incidents on occupied worlds where patrols vanished and outposts fell silent. And the Overmind dismissed these events as statistical anomalies in a war of such massive scale. But the incidents multiplied, spreading across Vreth-controlled space with impossible speed. And the pattern became undeniable. Something was hunting them. Regional commanders began dying in their sleep, their neural links severed by weapons that left no trace. And the knowledge of these deaths rippled through the collective faster than any official report. A supply depot on Krath 7 exploded without warning, destroying enough resources to fuel a campaign fleet. And survivors reported seeing nothing but shadows before the fires began. A breeding facility on Nexus 4 went dark, its millions of developing drones found dead from a biological agent that the Vreth had never encountered and could not identify. The collective mind that had once been a source of strength became a conduit for spreading terror, as every drone felt the fear of every other drone in an endless feedback loop. Captain Vasquez stood before the Concorde War Council and explained what was happening with the calm detachment of a surgeon, describing an operation fear in a hive mind is not like fear in individuals, she said, her voice steady and precise. When one Vreth feels afraid, every Vreth feels afraid, and that fear amplifies itself with each cycle through the network. Admiral Korath leaned forward with newfound respect in his eyes and asked how the humans had discovered this vulnerability. "We studied the neural core from Nexus Prime," Vasquez replied, "and we recognized patterns that our own history had taught us to understand." She pulled up a holographic display showing the Vreth command structure, highlighting nodes of particular importance. Humanity spent thousands of years perfecting the art of psychological warfare, learning how to break enemies without destroying them. And those lessons translate perfectly to hive mind combat. The Council watched in fascinated horror as she outlined the next phase of operations. A systematic campaign of terror that would strike at the Vreth's psychological foundations. "We will not try to win battles," Vasquez explained. "We will make them afraid to sleep, afraid to communicate, afraid to trust their own senses, and that fear will do more damage than any fleet." Over the following months, Fireteam Reaper became ghosts that haunted Vreth space, appearing without warning to strike targets of maximum psychological impact before vanishing back into the void. They killed Overminds in their chambers, destroyed symbols of Vreth power, and left messages in the wreckage that spread through the collective like poison. The phrase, "we are watching," became a trigger for panic throughout the Dominion. as drones who heard it would transmit their terror to millions of others instantaneously. Concord observers watched these operations with a mixture of awe and growing unease, because the efficiency of human warfare disturbed them on a fundamental level. They do not fight like warriors. Delegate Mira observed during a council session. They fight like predators, like hunters who take joy in the suffering of their prey. Ambassador Thelius shook his head and replied that he had spent time with the humans and had seen no joy in their work. Only grim determination and absolute focus. That is what disturbs me most, Myra admitted. They feel nothing as they do these terrible things, as if they have cut away the parts of themselves that would object. The humans began training volunteers from other Concord species, seeking to create units that could extend their operations beyond what 12 soldiers could accomplish. The training program was brutal by any standard, pushing candidates through physical and psychological challenges that would have been considered torture in peacetime. Of the first 500 volunteers, only 17 completed the course, and most of those bore scars that would never fully heal. But those 17 became something new. Soldiers who moved like shadows and thought like predators, who had learned to set aside mercy in service of victory. Captain Vasquez watched the first graduating class with something like pride and something like sorrow, knowing what they had sacrificed to become what the war demanded. The Vreth responded to the human campaign with a massive counteroffensive, sending their largest fleet to destroy human supply lines in a conventional attack they believed would cripple their enemy. Military logic demanded that the humans defend their logistics, that they protect the resources necessary to continue their operations. Instead, Vasquez ordered Fireteam Reaper to ignore the attack entirely and strike at the Vreth throne world while their fleet was away. The operation was suicide by any reasonable calculation. A dozen soldiers against the most heavily defended planet in Vreth space, but the humans did not calculate victory the way other species did. They landed on the throne world during the chaos of a manufactured crisis, slipping through defenses that were focused outward on threats that did not exist. For 6 hours they moved through the heart of Vreth power, destroying targets of symbolic and strategic importance, killing officials who had believed themselves untouchable. When the Vreth fleet received word of the attack and rushed back to defend their homeworld, they found the humans already gone, leaving behind devastation that sent shock waves through the entire collective. The Concord War Council demanded an explanation for the seemingly reckless decision to sacrifice supply lines, and Vasquez answered with words that would be studied by military theorists for centuries. War is not about what you can afford to lose, she said. It is about what the enemy cannot afford to lose. And we just proved that they cannot protect anything, not even their most sacred ground, the Vreth Overmind. The supreme consciousness that guided the entire Dominion broke its silence for the first time in the war. The message broadcast across all frequencies, reaching every corner of the galaxy, and it was not a threat or a demand or a declaration of war. It was a question, spoken in tones that the Concord translators interpreted as confusion and dawning terror. What are you? Captain Vasquez received the transmission on the bridge of the Concord flagship, surrounded by alien officers who waited anxiously for her response. She considered the question for a long moment, then keyed her communicator and sent a reply that every being in the galaxy would hear. We are the answer to every atrocity you have committed, she said, her voice cold and steady. We are the consequence you never believed would come. And we are just getting started. She paused, and when she spoke again, her words carried a weight that made the Vreth collective shudder across 1,000,000 worlds. We are human special forces, and you should have left this galaxy alone. The transmission ended, and silence fell across Vreth space as the implications sank into the collective consciousness. They had awakened something they did not understand, something that fought without mercy and feared nothing. And for the first time in their existence, the Vreth began to wonder if they had finally met an enemy they could not defeat. In the council chambers of Concord's Central Command, the alien leaders looked at the 12 humans with new eyes, seeing not primitive savages but the most terrifying warriors the galaxy had ever produced. And in the hearts of those leaders, a different kind of fear began to grow. A quiet question that no one dared speak aloud. What would happen when the war ended, and these weapons no longer had an enemy to fight? Sergeant First Class Maria Torres sat alone in the observation deck of the Concorde flagship, staring out at stars that seemed impossibly distant. Despite being close enough to touch, she had not truly slept in 15 years. Not the deep, restful sleep that other beings took for granted, because her training had rewired her brain to remain alert even in unconsciousness. Every night she drifted into a shallow rest while part of her mind kept watch for threats that might never come. And every morning she woke exhausted but functional, ready to do what needed to be done. This was the price of being what she was. The cost that no medal or honor could ever repay. Lieutenant Commander Park found her there an hour before dawn, his cybernetic eye casting a faint blue glow in the darkness of the observation deck. "Thinking about home?" he asked. Settling into the seat beside her, Torres shook her head slowly and admitted that she could not remember what home felt like anymore. That the word had become meaningless sounds without emotional weight. Park nodded in understanding, because he carried his own burdens that he rarely spoke about. "I used to have a sister," he said quietly. "Her name was Ji Ian, and she would make me laugh with terrible jokes that only worked in Korean." He paused, and when he continued his voice had grown distant. "I cannot remember her face anymore, cannot hear her voice in my memories, cannot feel anything when I think about the day she died in the Seoul bombing." Torres reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that felt foreign after so many years of keeping others at distance. "We gave up those parts of ourselves so others would not have to," she reminded him. "That was the choice we made." "I know," Park replied. "But some nights I wonder if there's anything left inside me except the mission, except the endless preparation for the next operation." They sat together in silence as the stars wheeled slowly past the observation window. Two soldiers who had sacrificed their humanity to protect a galaxy that feared them almost as much as it needed them. Captain Vasquez found them there when she came looking for her team, and something in her eyes suggested she understood exactly what they had been discussing. "The Council wants to see us," she announced. "They have concerns they wish to express." The three of them walked together through corridors that fell silent as they passed, alien crew members stepping aside with expressions that mixed respect with undeniable fear. In the council chamber, High Counselor Thaven rose to greet them with formal courtesy that could not quite hide his unease. "We wish to discuss the future," he began, his ancient voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of galactic leadership. "Specifically, we wish to discuss what role humanity will play once this conflict is ended." Vasquez nodded calmly and asked him to speak freely. Thaven exchanged glances with his fellow counselors before continuing. "There are some among us who fear that the weapons we have unleashed cannot be controlled," he admitted. "They look at what you have accomplished and wonder what would happen if that power were ever turned against the Concorde itself." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Torres felt her hands tighten into fists at her sides. But Vasquez showed no anger, no offense, only that same calm certainty that had carried her through impossible missions and unthinkable challenges. "You are right to ask this question," she said, her voice gentle but firm. 200 years ago, humanity could have conquered this galaxy with the technology we had developed. Could have built an empire that would make the Vreth look like children playing at war. She stepped forward, and even the ancient Eldari counselors found themselves leaning back from the intensity in her eyes. We chose not to, she continued. We looked at the path of conquest and domination, and we decided that was not what we wanted to become. She gestured at herself and her teammates, at the scars and cybernetics and thousand-yard stares that marked them as something more and less than human. We built weapons like us instead, she said. Soldiers who could protect without conquering, who could fight without seeking power, who could be terrible when necessary and then return to peace. They even studied her for a long moment before asking how the Council could trust such promises from a species they barely understood. Vasquez smiled. And for just an instant, Torres glimpsed something warm beneath the warrior's mask she wore. You cannot trust promises, Vasquez admitted, but you can trust actions, and our actions have never been about conquest. Only protection. She straightened and addressed the full council with words that would be recorded and studied for generations. We are not your enemies, she declared. We are the blade you never knew you needed. And we are also the hand that sheathes it when the cutting is done. The council session ended without resolution, as such things often did, but something had shifted in the way the aliens looked at the humans who walked among them. 3 days later, the Vreth launched their most desperate gambit of the war. A human colony ship carrying 50,000 civilians had been captured during the chaos of the supply line attacks. And the Vreth Overmind broadcast an ultimatum that echoed across every frequency. Surrender your weapons, the message demanded, or watch your people die. The Concord Council convened an emergency session, arguing about protocols and negotiations and the impossibility of the situation. But Captain Vasquez did not wait for their debate to conclude. Fireteam Reaper deployed within 2 hours of receiving the ultimatum, launching a direct assault against the Vreth carrier that held the colonists hostage. The ship was a fortress of organic metal and living weapons, crewed by 10,000 Vreth soldiers who had been warned to expect exactly this kind of attack. It should have been impossible for 12 soldiers to breach such defenses. Impossible for them to fight through corridors designed to slaughter intruders. Impossible for them to reach the colonists before the Vreth could execute their threat. Vasquez led from the front, as she always did, her blade carving paths through enemies who died before they could raise the alarm. Her team moving behind her like shadows with terrible purpose. Park disabled security systems with thought-speed precision, while Torres cleared rooms with a violence that left nothing alive to threaten their advance. Private Chun, the youngest member of the team, was the first to reach the colonist holding area, and she held the position alone against waves of reinforcements until her teammates could arrive. The battle lasted 9 hours, and in that time, the 12 soldiers of Fireteam Reaper killed over 3,000 Vreth without losing a single member. When the rescue shuttles departed with all 50,000 colonists aboard, the Vreth carrier drifted empty and silent, a tomb for an army that had believed itself invincible. A young Eldari soldier named Kethos had volunteered for the extraction team, and he witnessed the final moments of the operation with eyes that would never forget. What he saw Sergeant Torres emerge from the carrier last, her armor scorched and dented but her stride unbroken. And Kethos found himself approaching her before his courage could fail. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you walk into certain death and survive?" Torres turned to look at him, and Kethos saw something ancient and tired behind her eyes. Something that had seen too much death to fear it anymore. "We do not walk into certain death," she replied, her voice flat and empty of emotion. She paused, and when she spoke again, Kethos felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold of space. "We bring it with us." The rescue operation became legend throughout Concord space. Proof that the humans were not merely soldiers, but something beyond mortal understanding. But in the quiet hours of the night, Torres sat alone again in the observation deck. and she wondered if the young Eldari had understood what she meant. She did not fear death because she had already died, had killed the woman she once was on the training fields of Earth, had sacrificed everything soft and human to become a weapon that could protect the innocent. The only thing left was the mission, the endless purpose that gave meaning to an existence that sometimes felt more like haunting than living. And somewhere in the void, the Vreth were preparing their final desperate assault, gathering every ship and soldier they had left for one last attempt to destroy the enemy that had broken their spirit. The war was approaching its end, and Torres knew that whatever came next would demand everything she had left to give. She closed her eyes and waited for the dawn, ready to bring death one more time to those who threatened the people she had sworn to protect. The Vreth throne world hung in space like a wound in reality, surrounded by the largest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled. And on the bridge of the Concord flagship, Admiral Korath studied the tactical display with grim determination. 12,000 warships, he announced to the assembled commanders, plus orbital defense platforms, ground-based weapons, and an estimated 50 million soldiers defending the overmined citadel. The odds were impossible by any reasonable calculation, but reasonable calculations had stopped applying the moment the humans entered this war. Captain Vasquez stood apart from the alien officers. Her team gathered around her in the quiet stillness that always preceded their most dangerous operations. Beside them stood 500 additional soldiers wearing the black armor of humanity's special forces, reinforcements that had arrived from Earth 3 days ago. The Concord leaders had expected more, had hoped for fleets and armies that would turn the tide through sheer numbers. But the humans had sent only warriors. "This is our full commitment?" Admiral Korath asked. Unable to hide his disappointment, Vasquez turned to face him with an expression that almost resembled amusement. "You still do not understand," she said quietly. "A single one of these soldiers is worth 1,000 of your regular troops, and 500 of them will be more than enough." The battle began at dawn by ship time. Concord fleets engaging the Vreth Armada in the largest naval engagement in galactic history. Capital ships exchanged fire across millions of kilometers, while fighters swarmed between them like angry insects. And the void filled with the debris of dying vessels, but the true assault was happening elsewhere. As human transport pods launched from hidden positions and burned toward the throne world below, Vasquez led the descent through a storm of defensive fire, her pod weaving between energy beams and explosive projectiles with precision that seemed almost supernatural around her. Other pods were not so fortunate, and she watched teammates she had trained with for decades vanish in bursts of flame that left no bodies to recover. They had known the cost before they launched, had accepted it as the price of ending this war once and for all. 312 soldiers reached the surface. The rest lost to defenses that had been designed to stop exactly this kind of attack. They landed in scattered groups across the fortress continent that surrounded the overmined citadel, immediately engaging Vreth defenders who vastly outnumbered them. Private Chun died in the first hour, overwhelmed by a swarm of drones that she held back long enough for her squad to reach. Their objective, Corporal Williams, fell defending a bridge that controlled access to the Citadel's power core. His body found later surrounded by over 200 dead Vreth. One by one, the soldiers of humanity gave their lives in service of the mission, each death buying time and distance for those who remained. Vasquez pushed forward through hell itself. Her original team of 12 reduced to 8, then 6, then 4. As the assault continued, Lieutenant Commander Park took a wound meant for her, his cybernetic eye flickering as he collapsed against the wall slick with Vreth blood. "Keep going," he managed to say, his voice weak but steady. "I will hold this position." Vasquez wanted to argue, wanted to stay and fight beside the man who had been her right hand for 20 years. But she knew that every second mattered. She clasped his shoulder once, a gesture that said everything words could not express. And then she led her remaining team deeper into the citadel. The Overmind's chamber was vast beyond comprehension. A cathedral of living tissue and pulsing energy that housed the consciousness directing the entire Vreth collective. Vasquez entered with Sergeant Torres and 2 others, the last survivors of humanity's greatest assault. Facing an enemy that had destroyed civilizations without number, the Overmind spoke directly into their minds. A voice like thunder and static that attempted to crush their will through sheer psychic force. It showed them visions of their own deaths, of Earth burning, of everything they loved reduced to ash and memory, that the humans had trained for this, had built walls in their minds that no psychic assault could breach. And they advanced through the mental storm without hesitation. Torres was the first to reach the Overmind's physical form, her blade finding vulnerabilities that should not have existed. And her sacrifice opened a path that Vasquez followed without pause. The final battle lasted only minutes, though it felt like hours to those who fought it when it ended. The Overmind lay dead, and the collective consciousness of the Vreth shattered across 1,000,000 worlds. Vasquez stood alone in the chamber, the last of her team fallen around her. And she allowed herself one moment of grief before activating her emergency beacon. The war was over. Of the 500 human soldiers who had launched the assault, 43 survived to see the victory they had purchased with so much blood of the original 12 members of Fireteam Reaper. Only 4 remained: Captain Vasquez, Sergeant Torres, who had somehow survived her wounds, and 2 others whose names would be carved in monuments across a grateful galaxy. The Concord offered them everything in its power to give: medals, titles, positions of honor, wealth beyond measure. They declined it all 3 months after the war ended. Captain Elena Vasquez returned to Earth, walking through streets that celebrated her name without knowing her face. She made her way to a small cemetery outside Geneva, where rows of simple white markers stood in perfect formation beneath ancient oak trees. These were the graves of Reaper operators going back generations, soldiers who had given everything so that others might live in peace. She placed flowers on each marker, speaking quietly to comrades she had lost and mentors who had shaped her into the weapon she had become. The sun was setting when a young woman approached, her movements careful and respectful as she waited for permission to speak. Vasquez recognized the signs immediately: the perfect posture, the watchful eyes, the coiled energy of someone who had begun the long process of becoming something more than human. "You have been selected for Special Forces training," Vasquez said without turning around. "Yes, Captain," the young woman replied. "I ship out next week." Vasquez finally turned to face her, seeing in those eager eyes a reflection of herself from decades ago, before the training had stripped away everything soft and uncertain. "What is your name, recruit?" "Sarah Chun, Captain, and I wanted to ask you something before I left." Vasquez nodded for her to continue. "What does it take?" Chun asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it take to become what you are?" Vasquez considered the question for a long moment, looking at the graves around them and then at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. "The galaxy will forget this war," she finally said. "They will forget the fleets, the politics, the treaties, and the battles that decided the fate of civilization." She turned back to the young recruit with eyes that held the weight of everything she had seen and done. "But they will remember the name," she continued. "They will tell their children's children. Do not wake the humans, let them sleep. Because when they rise, the stars themselves tremble." Chun listened in silence, understanding beginning to dawn on her face. "That is what it takes," Vasquez concluded. "Being willing to become a story that scares the dark. Being willing to sacrifice everything you are, so that others never have to know the horrors you have faced." She placed her hand on Chun's shoulder, the same gesture she had shared with Park in his final moments. "You will lose parts of yourself, that you cannot imagine living without. She warned, "You will do things that will haunt you forever, and you will become something that frightens everyone around you, including yourself." She paused, and something almost like a smile crossed her weathered face. "But you will also protect billions of lives, defend civilizations from threats they cannot comprehend, and carry a legacy that stretches back to the first human who stood between danger and those who could not fight." Chun straightened, her resolve visibly hardening as she absorbed the weight of what lay ahead. "I understand, Captain," she said. Vasquez nodded and released her shoulder, turning back to face the graves one final time. "Go then," she said quietly. "Become what the galaxy needs, and when you have given everything you have to give, come back here and place flowers for those who walked this path before you." Chun saluted and departed, leaving Vasquez alone with her memories and the growing darkness. In the years that followed, the story spread across 1,000 worlds, told in 1,000 languages by beings who had never met a human, but who knew the legend by heart. They spoke of warriors who moved like ghosts, who feared nothing and protected everything, who had broken an enemy that should have been unbeatable, and one name echoed across the stars, whispered in fear and reverence alike. A name that had become synonymous with the terrible, beautiful truth of what humanity could become when the innocent needed protection. Human Special Forces, the blade that defended the galaxy, and the reason the darkness would think twice before rising again.